Good morning. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Jillian Rich, Secretary of the National Press Club and Senior Reporter at Investors Business Daily in Washington. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Book and Author Talk with Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations and author of Resolved, Uniting Nations in a Divided World. We'll get started in a moment, but just a reminder, we are happy to accept your questions and we'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. Ban Ki-moon, a foreign minister of South Korea with more than 30 years working in international diplomacy, became the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations in January 2007. By that time, he and his colleagues had helped his impoverished and war-torn country grow into one of the world's wealthiest nations. South Korea appeared set to become a model for other developing countries. The soft-spoken Ban hoped to focus the United Nations on bringing similar economic growth to other areas of the globe. But a series of international crises over the next decade took attention away from his ambitious economic development plans. That chaotic period included the Arab Spring, the Ebola epidemic, bloody new conflicts in Central Africa, genocide in the Sudan, Russia's incursion into Georgia, and the spread of nuclear weapons in Iran and North Korea, all against the backdrop of the growing impacts of climate change. As he brought his own skills and the power of UN to bear in solving the world's crises, he also weathered a few of his own. The UN became the focus of sharp criticism after a deadly cholera outbreak in Haiti was linked to UN peacekeepers sent there to restore order after a major earthquake. In his new memoir, Resolved, Uniting Nations in a Divided World, Mr. Ban grapples with reforming the United Nations, the impact of the Haiti disaster on the UN's image, and what he calls the difficult cousins of North Korea. He also offers a candid assessment of what lies ahead. Mr. Ban, it is our pleasure to welcome you to the National Press Club. The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Ms. Jillian Rich. Distinguished members of the National Press Club. It's a great honor for me and pleasure to have this opportunity. Before I engage with you through a Q&A, let me just say a few words. I appreciate, first of all, your interest in my memoir, Resolved, Uniting the Nations in a Divided World. I hope this book will inspire possibility, spark actions, improve cooperation, and ultimately encourage people around the world to become global citizens. During my 5 decades long public service, both in Republic of Korea, 37 years, and 10 more years at the United Nations as a Secretary General. This is my, in fact, first ever memoir. I have never written a book in the past because of time, etc., etc. But I thought after my retirement, it is my duty to share with the world's people my experience. Be they successful or disappointing or still ongoing? I just wanted to leave this message to my staff as well as the Secretary General of the United Nations and other general public. As you may know, my own lifespan coincides with the colonialism, wars, dictatorship, and the struggle for democracy in Korea and around the world. I myself have gone through those turbulent periods as a Korean citizen, as well as a leader of the United Nations. I was raised during the Korean War in 1950, came of age and terrible poverty, and watched my country grow from dictatorship to stable and prosperous democracy with the help of the United Nations. Without the United Nations, Korea would not be as she is today. These experiences grounded me in the importance of peace, opportunity, and international cooperation, partnership, beliefs that shaped my life and my tenure as a Secretary General of the United Nations. My commitment continues to this day, even after my retirement. I run or chair nearly a dozen of organizations, international or private and national, devoted to sustainable development, human rights, climate change, and empowerment of women, girls, and youth. So many things. I often wonder if we have forgotten lessons we had learned. One needs only to look at global temperature rising, alliances fracturing, and refugees fleeing to understand our precarious conditions. Why are we not doing more and better? To me, the fault most often lies with the leaders of the world. Too many autocrats and also dictators put themselves before the countries and before the people who they elected them and their country. These rulers are selfish and short-sighted when they need to think as global citizens. In times of extreme pressure, such as the COVID-19 and also the climate crisis, I was disappointed to see even the rich and generous and prosperous nations look inward first. Encouragingly, during the most recent G7 meeting, G7 the leaders committed at least 1 billion doses of vaccine and support for developing countries, and also committed again, reaffirmed their commitment to mobilize at least $100 billion a year to help developing countries in addressing climate change. Multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, are now weaker than they were in even 1990s. As of today, the Security Council's perpetual deadlock has cost its credibility. Key regional groups are alarmingly diminished because of the internal divisions. We need more alliances among civil societies, NGOs, international organizations, academics, philanthropic organizations. These collaborations were powerful during negotiations of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, because they leveraged and combined their unique strengths, interests, constituencies, and resources together. It is essential that we work to overcome hatred of the others and resist the endless quest for economic expansion, religious dominance, and military power. Now, for example, the people of Myanmar need our support as the military authorities, known as a Tatmadaw, responds with the violence. 850 people have been killed and more than 4,500 people are now under detention, including Aung San Suu Kyi and President of Myanmar. And on another Middle East, while I fully appreciate the genuine security concerns of Israeli people, unless two-state solutions are not respected by both sides, it will be the Palestinian people who will suffer by the overpowering military forces and national strength of Israel. Therefore, leaders of two-state should sit down together and work on the peace and development. The Afghan people, especially women and girls, must be protected from the most extreme Taliban edict. It is time for the United Nations and its member states help to create a new peace framework for Afghanistan as the United States and the NATO forces are going to withdraw by September. Ladies and gentlemen of the NPC, we have so much work ahead. In fact, that's one of the reasons I decided to write a memoir to encourage leaders, lawmakers, and anyone who aspires to make the world healthier, more peaceful, and equitable so that everybody, regardless of where you are, what you are, can live in peace and security and harmony. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be very happy for your comments and questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that intro. Your memoir gave you a chance to publicly reveal your inner thoughts and feelings about some of the biggest events of your tenure. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to finally unleash your private thoughts in this book, and was it difficult to write?
Of course, I could not write all what had happened. It might be more than 1,000, 2,000 pages. How to just make sure that within 350 pages, I was asked by the publisher that it should not be longer than 350 pages. So it has to be selective, and which really I thought should be the basis of some lessons. And I really wanted to show and let the people know the challenges of the United Nations and what needs to be done more. Why United Nations has not been functioning as it has been, conceived and decided in 1945 by world leaders. That will be very important lessons. Of course, my predecessors, they have all left their own memoirs, but time and circumstances have always been different. They must have their own agonies and challenges at that time, but myself in 21st century, when everything should be more than enough in terms of resources and in terms of transportation and communication, technology and sciences. But why then can we not do better than our predecessors? Now, in a sense that when it comes to multilateralism, we have suffered a lot most recently because of the multilateralism in disarray. But that is caused by not the people, but caused by the leaders. Sometimes leaders of most powerful and strongest of countries like the United States. Look at what had happened during last 4 years during President Trump when climate change was not respected and JCPOA was withdrawn by the President Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of leadership has shown a lot of concerns to the people. Then it is only the people on the ground who will suffer. That is what I felt very much heartbreaking.
So is there a future next memoir for you to get the rest of your thoughts out there?
Well, I would not dare to write second one. Otherwise, it took a long time because I have had the limited time. While a retiree, looking very just a private citizen, but I'm not just a private citizen. I have had, as I told you earlier in my remarks, I'm still holding a lot of official international responsibilities, both at home and abroad. Therefore, that has made me very busy and difficult to find time. So I don't know whether it is a good thing or not. Because of a complete lockdown, I was able to have more time to focus in writing my memoir. In fact, otherwise, it would have taken much longer time. But I found that it is very difficult, a challenging one to write a book.
That's true. So speaking of staying busy now that you've retired from the UN, you were appointed the head of the Olympics Ethics Commission in 2017. The next two Olympics have some controversy clouding them, with COVID-19 still a concern in Japan, and there are calls to boycott the games in China over Beijing's human rights records. Can you give us your thoughts on the future of the Olympic Games in light of those controversies?
Each time and each country may have certain problems. And I think that this sports and politics should be separated. And sports should not be misused, abused because of certain issues. Of course, there was some such cases when some countries decided not to participate in Olympic, like Moscow Olympic in 1980s. 80s, mostly United States and Western Bloc boycotted. And because of pandemic, there was some also sentiment, even among Japanese people, that they should cancel these Olympic Games. I am encouraged that IOC and Japanese government have decided to carry on these Olympic Games. During my time, I and the leadership of IOC worked very closely and established sort of peace through sports. So this, you cannot find any other tools which can instantly mobilize power and passion and energy than sports. We were thinking that how we can mobilize this energy and power generated by the sports. That is why I've been working very closely with the IOC leadership, Thomas Bach, current president, and Jacques Rogue, a former president. And I've been really participating all the Olympic Games and even run torch bearing, and every April 6th was designated by the General Assembly as International Sports Day, UN Sports Day. So on that day, we really organized some meaningful event so that the spirit and harmony and cooperation, mutual respect, and passion and energy will also be used to bring peace and harmony among people. So I am very happy to report this kind of initiative. Yeah.
All right. So going back to look at your legacy as Secretary General, is there a challenge you wish you could change or make a different decision on?
There are many. Looking back, and while as in incumbency, I thought that United Nations could be reformed better so that we can deliver much better. When people say that, when people talk about reform of the United Nations, usually they point to the United Nations Security Council, particularly among five most powerful veto-wielding countries, permanent members of the Security Council. On many occasions, United Nations could not have been able to deliver timely and effective and powerful messages or action because of the divisions among the Security Council members, particularly veto power countries. Look at the case of Syria. Since 2011, a lot of people have been killed. At least 6.6 million Syrian people have become refugees. here and there, like in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt. And more than 5 million people are living under poverty level, poverty line in Egypt. Most of the infrastructures and health systems have been broken. This is a tragedy, but because of the veto, United Nations has not been able to deliver even humanitarian issues. I read yesterday that United States is now trying to deliver food assistance through Turkey, but there should be no such restrictions when it comes to genuinely humanitarian support. And this is not the only Syria. There are so many countries around the world whose people are just suffering without being able to say anything because of the inability to deliver by the United Nations. And another aspect of the United Nations, as a Secretary General, I really tried my best how to make the United Nations system beside this Security Council, just the overall general functioning of the United Nations system. Secretariat and special agencies and other agencies should work meeting the expectation of the world's people. But on many cases, we have not been able to deliver as much as possible. That is what I've been really trying to reform how the Secretariat, how the UN organization performed their businesses, but it was quite difficult. It was quite difficult. I hope my successor, Antonio Guterres, will continue to carry on. But in terms of transparency, accountability, work ethics, I think I made great improvement.
What other types of reforms would you like to see from the UN?
Pardon?
What other types of reforms would you like to see from the UN?
First of all, I really tried to make United Nations transparent and accountable. I asked all the staff above the rank of Assistant Secretary General to report their financial situations to the ethics committee so that their financial situation will be reviewed. And also, I really wanted to make the United Nations more movable and transferable between the field offices and the headquarters. There are tens of thousands UN staff who are working in the field and at the center and headquarters like New York, Geneva, Paris, and all these good places. But once you are stuck in somewhere, then you can never come out of these places. I thought that it was unfair, unreasonable, so that everybody should have equal opportunities of, first of all, cultivating their capacity to work as staff of the United Nations. I really tried much, but not much. Then I wanted to make our communication systems. In this 21st century of science and technology, we were using all different type of communication at that time. Now I think I made it communicable throughout the UN system. So that is one aspect. And in terms of some justice issues, we established for the first time, during my time, we established appeals court and dispute court, dispute tribunal and appeals tribunal. Whenever staff has some issues to appeal, then they would bring this matter to the dispute tribunal. Then if a dispute tribunal decision is not satisfactory, then they can go up appeals tribunal. This is something like a judicial system of the United Nations. Yeah.
So you guided the UN through a variety of health crises during your 10 years as Secretary General, including the Ebola crisis in West Africa. What are your thoughts on the UN's actions amid the coronavirus pandemic? Would you have done anything differently if you were still in charge?
I think this current COVID-19 should have been taken in a different approach. First of all the UN systems and all the nations, they should have a fully collaborated together, working together. When Ebola happened in Western Africa, Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, the fatality rate was very high. It's much, much higher than coronavirus. It was a 45% fatality rate. So that means 1 out of 2 patients would die. Then for the first time in the history of the United Nations has established a mission addressing to deal with the virus and disease, like UNMIA, United Nations missions, Ebola mission, Ebola emergency mission, UNMEER, UNMEER. That was headquartered in Ghana, and based on Ghana, then we were trying to help all those affected countries. Then, as you know, we have United Nations deploys United Nations peacekeeping forces in over a dozen places in Africa and Middle East elsewhere. Then for the first time in the history, United Nations again deployed military forces. United States, United Kingdom, France, they deployed military forces to block the frontier so that there should be no free movement. This is sort of a local lockdown at that time. So this is what we were able to do that. Now, in the case of COVID-19, it was mainly done with the WHO. But United States withdrew from membership of WHO at the beginning. So that was a totally unacceptable, policies on the part of United States. The Security Council, in the case of Ebola, just within 1 day, adopted a resolution declaring that Ebola was a serious threat to the maintenance of peace and security of international community. Now, what happened to Ebola? It took 3 months for the Security Council to declare that COVID-19 was a serious threat to international peace and security because of the division among big powers, particularly between Western powers and China about the origin of this Ebola. So there's a huge difference. In fact, I have communicated, even as a former Secretary General, I telephoned to Director General of WHO, Tedros, with whom I worked very closely. And then I advised him that this issue should better be handled by the United Nations headquarters, whole organization, not the WHO alone. I think this is a lesson which we must learn very seriously, not to repeat the same mistake if and when this kind of virus may happen. Virus can happen anytime because a human being has been degrading our ecosystem. So then I think the more and more such kind of pandemics may happen. That is why we have to take urgent action, first of all, to care our nature. I've been repeatedly stating while in service that nature has its own way, we cannot negotiate with nature. Then when I met the Pope Francis just 2 years ago as a retired Secretary General, at that time there was no such COVID-19. He told me very inspiring word, God forgives everybody. Human beings sometimes forgive, but nature never forgives. This is very true. Nature will never tolerate what human being has been abusing, the privileges given to us by our nature. So this is a lesson. So we should not repeat. We should care ourselves, humanity, and the planet Earth.
So in your opening remarks, you mentioned what the G7 is doing in donating vaccines to poorer countries. Do you believe that wealthy countries and the G7 need to do more?
I think that they should do more. But as everybody will agree, G7 countries and many other countries, well-to-do countries, they were doing only for themselves. Now that the United States and Europeans are in a position to have some sort of herd immunity, then it was quite encouraging that they decided in the name of G7 to provide 1 billion. I think that it will come more. And the United States President Joe Biden announced that US will provide 500 million out of this. And another one is as a way to address accelerating climate phenomena, this $100 billion, which was committed in 2009 in Copenhagen COP meeting, and also reaffirmed at the time of Paris Agreement, then this has not been, this is the first year to mobilize $100 billion. They should do every year. So I expected that G7 countries should have declared more in detail the roadmaps, how they could mobilize this one, rather than just saying in word. As one of the 230 former global leaders, I signed a letter of appeal to the leaders of G7 to exactly do that. And I am grateful for their response, favorable, positive response through their G7 meeting. But it's not only G7 meeting, G7 countries, business leaders, they should also do all what can. And there should be a global partnership forged strongly, like a government, the business, and civil society. So when there is a strong tripartite partnership among these three entities, then we will be much better. We can leave this planet Earth in a sustainable way through to our succeeding generation. And as you may see, I'm wearing this badge on my lapel. This is Sustainable Development Goals. United Nations has made this one then as a way to really let people know the importance of Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm always wearing and talk about the importance of implementing all 17 goals and target should be met by 2030. This is our very important mandate and responsibility as a global citizen.
So speaking of the Sustainable Development Goals, how effective have they been so far? And do you think that they will meet that ambitious deadline?
It is much better than MDG, Millennium Development Goals. In fact, the Millennium Development Goals was intended to help those developing countries. And the result was not that successful, except the goal number one, reducing in half the number of people living in abject poverty. That was achieved in Millennium Development Goals. But that was also possible because of a Chinese contribution, Chinese hard work. The Chinese were able to lift almost 400 million people out of poverty by 2010. Then World Bank was able to declare that number one goal was achieved already, but other goals were not achieved. Like many still by the time 2015, this MDG was targeted. Then there were still more than 60 million people, students, who are not able to go to school, um, elementary school, and there were many people who were suffering from HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and there were many people who were still dying from preventable diseases. Now, 17 Sustainable Development Goals are targeting by 2030. We have 9 more years to go. We really must mobilize all necessary resources, use 21st century science and technology, and use a more stronger, tighter global partnership. This is the way which we can reduce our number of people who are not able to educated, also who are suffering from abject poverty, who are dying from preventable diseases. By that time, there should be no such people who should die unnecessarily.
Great. Let's go back to talking about your memoir for a little bit. You say in your book that the 2010 cholera outbreak forever destroyed the UN's reputation in Haiti, and you are critical of the lawsuits that victims have brought against the UN over the outbreak. Is it fair to criticize the victims pursuing lawsuits? And is there something that the UN can do to repair its reputation in the eyes of the Haitian people?
I never criticized the victims who really wanted to get the legal aid. Only point I was trying to say that UN was not liable legally in accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Privileges and Immunities. This is what I really wanted to say, and I really did my best efforts as a human being, as a Secretary General. I was the second person, only after then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who flew to the earthquake-stricken Haiti. And I and former President Bill Clinton, in his capacity as a special envoy on Haiti, and Hillary Clinton, we sat down together and invited global leaders to mobilize a necessary fund. $9.9 billion were mobilized in just a single day, That is, I think, a record-breaking at the time. Then I went to Haiti several times, meeting the families of the victims and really sympathized with them. And I visited many houses where people were grieving. And I really tried to really improve, first of all, health systems. Almost all health systems were broken down by that time, and the government was not moving. Particularly President Preval was almost seemed to be lost himself. And the politicians were fighting among themselves without caring people. So UN did all, but I am sad the relationship between the UN and Haiti is probably seriously tarnished because of that, because of this cholera epidemic, which people thought that was originated because of peacekeepers. That's why I established expert scientists, a group of scientists composed of United States, Brazil, Peru, and India. And their first report finding was that it was because of the confluence of circumstances, the worn down people in terms of health and as well as health systems, etc. Then there was a challenge against this. WHO just they found that it was caused by peacekeepers, and that's why I established a second expert group with the different people and different countries. I really wanted to be as much compassionate as possible as I could do, and as much as United Nations system could do. Margaret Chan, Director General of the WHO, and I really tried our best trying to mobilize. As I was leaving my job on December 1st, 2016, I finally reported to the General Assembly, made my apology that United Nations had not been able to do as much as we should have done. And I also proposed to establish sort of some trust fund, development fund with the $400 million. But unfortunately, the member states' support was utterly minimum. It was not funded much, but I had to leave. I hope that my successor would have carried on this one. So I'm not trying to avoid any responsibilities. I apologized, and there is clearly moral responsibility. So I hope there should be no misunderstanding on this issue. The UN should have learned a lot. UN lost the most number of staff, 102 UN staff, including the head of UN mission and also head of UN peacekeeping mission, commanding general. So we lost a lot. I think that's the most number of sacrifices which happened to the United Nations peacekeeping operations and UN missions.
So if not lawsuits, what can the grieving Haitian people do after this?
A lawsuit, when it comes to lawsuit, the State Department of the United States said that they had no jurisdiction over this issue. And the two courts, one district court and appeals court, they judged that they did not have a jurisdiction, and the United Nations was not the subject of a legal suit. This is the fact. This is the fact. I know that there was some, movement, a campaign to sue the United Nations. At that time, we were feeling very much embarrassed, and we were trying to defend by our lawyers. But it's not because of our lawyers, but it is because of the international law, the Vienna Convention, which declared that UN was not legally liable and was not the subject of legal suit. There should be no misunderstanding on this, yes.
So is there something that the UN can do to repair its reputation in Haiti? And what are some concrete actions that the UN can take to ensure that what happened there never happens again?
I think even now, the UN should and could do more with the help of the international community. We dispatched the engineering team immediately after earthquake happened. The China, Japan, and Korea. I think that those three countries were the first respondent to send their engineering team. Of course, many Latin American countries also sent to their neighboring countries. But now that it has passed already 11 years since 2010. I hoped that leadership of Haitian government, they should do more. But now, as I read all these articles, since I have not been dealing with this method in person directly after my retirement, President Moise is not doing much, and they are still divided politically. Then the United Nations, the priority seems to have been lowered because there are so many, burning issues in the world. So I hope that there should be more, which United Nations can really help the Haitian people. At the same time, Haitian government and people, they should do their own work. Yeah.
So you devote a chapter of your book to Israel and Gaza. What are your thoughts on what occurred in the Gaza Strip in May and the most recent attacks earlier this week? And what action do you believe the UN should take?
Now, while two-state solutions remains the best way to ensure equal right and security and prosperity for Israelis and Palestinian people, I'm afraid to tell you that its realization seems to be increasingly remote now. I was deeply concerned and disappointed that just only after 3 days of a new government was installed under the leadership of Prime Minister Bennett, they had airstrike Hamas. Of course, it was a counter measure against Hamas's balloon bombs. So I think nobody should be blamed, but the reality, what is happening on the ground, is very worrisome and troubling for me. Israel's, I think, a decades-long occupation of Palestine territories is not something, something like a conflict between equal partners, equal parties. The latest cycle of violence between Israel and Hamas or Palestine as a whole illustrates failure and the consequences of Gaza blockade. Addressing the root causes of a violent conflict must underpin any long-term solutions. I have been meeting former Prime Minister Netanyahu so many times, and also his predecessor, Ehud Olmert, and also other opposition leaders and military leaders many times during my tenure time, because that was one of the priority conflict issues since long. The recent 11-day war between Israel and Hamas was one of the most serious conflict in recent years. For me personally, the war reminded me of my own direct personal diplomacy, which I termed it in my memoir as a conveyor belt diplomacy. At that time, when there was a crisis happened in December, late December 2008, I went to this region early January. At that time, President Bush administration was about to leave. So Secretary Condi Rice was not on the scene, and the Bush administration was not taking any action. Then I really flew in and visiting 4 countries in a day, meeting the leaders of the 4 countries. It was once you are sitting on a conveyor belt, it was just moving around. First thing I did was my meeting with the President Mubarak of Egypt, how he can help. And then my idea was that, and his idea too, was that Israel should declare ceasefire unilaterally. And I directly went to Prime Minister Olmut and asked him to do that. But of course, he was very much opposing. How come if I should declare ceasefire unilaterally, then what about if Hamas continues to attack? Then I told him that I'll make sure that Hamas respond positively. Then I flew immediately to Jordan to get some influence of King of Jordan, Abdullah. Then I went to Syria, meeting President Abbas, Bashar Abbas at the time. I asked him strongly, why don't you play a constructive role, urging Hamas to respond positively to unilateral decision of Israel. But he said that I don't have any control, influence over Hamas. I just shot back that Hamas is headquartered in Damascus. How come you say you are not doing anything? Then after leaving that, I flew again to Sharm el Sheikh, where leaders from European Union and Middle East were gathered to just to talk about, discuss about this crisis. At that time, I received a note from Syrian ambassador to Egypt, just saying that Hamas will soon agree to the unilateral ceasefire. That's the way we were able to stop this violence. Then second time, 2013, I flew together with Secretary Clinton, and we walked, visiting all the places. And 2014, I worked together with John Kerry, then Secretary of State. So it was kind of some coordination among the allies as well as the United Nations, and also trying to convince the regional leaders. This is what we expected to see before the most recent conflict continued 11 days. So I hope that Israelis, and now that there is a new government, Israelis and Palestinian leaders should sit down together and try to make some workable agreement, which should not be broken by one side. And there should be some accountability. The lack of accountability for one-sided attacks, either by Israelis or by Hamas. That's why we see the cycle of continuation of the conflict between the two parties. Now, I expect the new Prime Minister Bennett and the President Mahmoud Abbas will really sit down together. And if I may say another one, Israel should stop annexing the portion of the West Bank. Annexation and continuing illegal settlement remain a continuing source of conflict, domestically, regionally, and internationally. Annexation would continue a most serious violation of international law. It will harm the prospect of a two-state solution. The Security Council has been taking many resolutions urging Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. That is the two-state solution. So I am urging, first of all, leaders of these two, and there are, again, for Israelis, with this Abraham Accord, there are more and more friends from Arab state. Therefore, this is a good time so that they can agree on this, some permanent peace regime.
Okay. All right, before I ask the final question, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners co-team leaders Donna Linewin-Ligier and Lori Russo. Today's headliner event coordinator Alyssa Free, club membership director Kate Helster, and club executive director Bill McCarran. I would also like to tell you about our upcoming National Press Club headliners. On August 2nd, we'll welcome documentary filmmakers Ken Burns, Sarah Burns, and David McMahon to discuss their new PBS documentary, Muhammad Ali. And on August 6th, please join us to hear from U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, Jr., who will speak about the Air Force's mission in an ever-changing national security environment. All right, now for our last questions. Mr. Bond, you have spent nearly your entire adult life as a diplomat. What is a negotiation tip that you think everyone should know?
First of all, listen carefully from the other parties, what their genuine concerns and interests would be, before you just trying to impose one-sidedly to the other party. Then you will never be able to agree on anything. So treat the other party equally as a genuine, genuine support and respect each other. That is the basic starting point of any negotiation. And try to make yourself be trusted by the other party. I often talk to my staff and other that you can learn from water. Normally, people regard water just bad. It doesn't have any color. It doesn't have any taste. It doesn't have value. First of all, so people often saying that, well, this person is spending money like water, spraying water like spraying water, but there is nothing which can be strong like water. For example, I've been speaking to our UN staff, and even I talked to President Obama, that his leadership style should be like water. Water flows constantly from higher ground to lower ground. If water does not flow and stay one place, that means water becomes stale and corrupt. This is sort of corruption. And water does not confront unnecessarily. In the course of its flow, it just flow. When it meets a rock in the middle of the river, then it just goes around this rock, does not confront unnecessarily. But if and when it is absolutely necessary, it can just roll huge rocks and even destroy, cement, concrete buildings, and everything can be just swept away, but does not use that kind of force. However, you may be resourceful and powerful, you should not use that power in the negotiation. Then this is the lesson which one can learn from the basic nature of water. This is what Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu 2,600 years ago taught us, and that has influenced me very heavily on that. And I've been really trying to teach the lessons to other people. Then what is important is a mutual respect. Whether the other is enemy, then just listen carefully what their concerns are. Whether it is a legitimate concern, then you should be ready to accommodate their legitimate concern as much as possible, rather than just insisting on your own. You cannot win over always forever over others. That is not, even though there may be an agreement, this agreement is not sustainable. It can be broken anytime. That is what we are seeing in the case of Middle East, Israelis and Palestinians. You cannot use always force. And there should be dialogue and try to understand what their genuine concerns and aspirations are. That is the first thing that any negotiator should know. That has been my style, my way of diplomacy. With that, I have been, first of all, earned respect and support and confidence and trust in me from the other leaders. And then on the basis of this, I also would say what United Nations really wanted the country or leaders to.
All right, I know it's very late for you in Korea, but we have a student question from our audience as our last question. What is the best way for a young person to become involved with the UN? And do you have any advice for becoming a peacekeeper in the medical non-military field?
In this 21st century, I think this is an era of youth. There was no such department or organization in the United Nations when I assumed my job. Then two things I did. First, I established UN Women to do much more to empower women. And I think I did a lot in terms of empowering women, as all record may indicate. Then I thought about youth. For the first time, I appointed a 28-year-old young man named Muhammad Al-Hendawi as a Secretary General's Special Envoy on Youth. And he was working with the very senior leadership of the United Nations and also other countries just to promote the youth empowerment. Now he has been succeeded by his successor, another Sri Lankan lady now, who is in charge of this youth empowerment. Of course, there is a limit at this time in terms of scale and size and also resources given to this special envoy, but it has given very strong messages to the people of youth around the world. And each time, wherever I went, I tried to meet the youth and try to give them a good sense of hope. And United Nations can, there are many positions are available for young people who really want to have life career in the United Nations, working for peace and development and human rights. And I really welcome, and this is what I am also doing still in Korea and elsewhere. And I established my own foundation called the Pan Foundation for global citizenship, global citizens. So have global citizenship. I'm telling the young people, then those young people will have much more area to contribute to the current world. Now, when I was a young boy, as a high school boy, I was quite fortunate enough to meet President John F. Kennedy in 1962. At that time, I did not meet even the mayor of my city, let alone President of Korea. But I met the President of the United States. At that time, he gave us a very inspiring message that young people can do everything, while political leaders during Cold War could not do. He said that the political leaders do not talk much, but you young people, you can do it. And national boundaries do not mean much. But the question is whether you are ready to extend your helping hands. That is very inspiring. So have some compassion. Also, of course, you must have a full of passion. So this passion should be accompanied with compassion. That means then only then you can become a genuine global citizen and you can contribute to the the well-being of all people and the human rights and the peace and development of this world. And I really count on young people, young generations' future.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bond, for coming today to talk about your memoir and about some current events happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.